My name's Chris Knittel, professor in applied economics here at Sloan. I hold a few other hats that we'll get to in the presentation. Another one that is not highlighted in the presentation is I'm the Associate Dean for Climate and Sustainability here at Sloan. So I view my job as not only promoting good uh, climate change policy, but also coordinating the efforts here at Sloan and across the Institute uh, with everybody that's working on climate change and sustainability and adjacent topics. So what I thought I'd talk to you all about today is the fairly new Climate Policy Center. But more than that, I want to give it the context of what's going on more generally on campus around climate, and how hopefully you can get involved if you come to MIT Sloan. So just an agenda setting slide here. I'll start by talking about Sally's vision, so Professor Kornbluth's vision around climate on campus, and then really highlight how MIT Sloan is playing an integral part in that strategy. And through the Climate Policy Center, I'll give you a lens on some of the early work that we've done with both policymakers in Washington, D.C., internationally, and at the state level, and our ongoing strategy. So when Sally came, every time you get a new president at a university, you're always worried about what their goals and their focus areas will be. Fortunate for me, at least, as somebody who works a lot on climate, right off the bat, Sally continued to mention climate as one of her top priorities as she leads MIT. And in particular, she often brings this analogy of what's called the Rad Lab. So during World War II, MIT played an integral part in the development of radar, and it was an all of MIT focus across campus. And Sally views that with climate as well, in the sense that it'll take everybody on campus to pull their weight in solving the climate or solving climate change. And she wants to do it fast. So she also often talks about making a real impact on the trajectory of climate change and CO2 emissions within the next decade. And part of that strategy was to invest $50 million of MIT money into creating the climate project. And I'll have a couple slides on what that looks like in a little bit. But like the Rad Lab, it was meant to be an all of MIT approach to bring in all the schools at MIT, and in particular Sloan. She has always seen an integral part of Sloan in commercializing and diffusing the technologies that might come from this effort, as well as understanding the policies and the economics behind what is required to make a real impact over the next decade. Concurrent to that, and actually before Sally came on campus, Bethany, myself, and David Goldston, who is recently departed director of the MIT Washington office, we were circulating a thought piece on what a climate policy center might look like at MIT. And we all had different motivations. I'm going to talk about mine in particular, that my motivation came from a frustration of mine in my academic career where, maybe I'm overstating things, but I was thinking I was doing really important work related to climate policy, and it wasn't being translated and turned into policy as fast as I would like to see it. And we sort of crafted a vision for a climate policy center that could make that happen, so that we can be better at taking the research that's already done at MIT. So this is less about doing more research, but really amplifying the impact of the research that's already being done at MIT. and turning that and working directly with policymakers to turn that into actual policy. Unbeknownst to me, actually, Dave Schmidtlein, our previous dean, called me into his office late 2023 and said, I really like this idea, and I want to commit $25 million of Sloan's endowment to create this center. Very sadly, Dave then, for health reasons, had to step down in early 2024. But his vision in this center has continued after that. And we now have the MIT Climate Policy Center. And it's important that it's not the MIT Sloan Climate Policy Center, it's the MIT Climate Policy Center. It's not meant to just work within Sloan. It's really meant for Sloan to have an impact across campus and to take, like I said, that research all across campus and turn it into actual climate policy. We have Elsa Olivetti as affiliated faculty member in material science, Christoph Reinhard in architecture, Shiji Zhang in urban studies, as well as others all around campus. We also have a team of researchers. So we have 2 postdocs and 2 growing graduate students. But more importantly for the work is we also have former congressional staffers and people who are sitting in DC, some full-time, that are able to knock on doors and to really push the research that's being done here at MIT. Let me just mention the problem that we were trying to solve here. And I already gave you a hint in the sense that this is less about generating new research and more about translating research. And the current state, I'll just use some of my research as an example. And then I'll go backwards actually in a second. But as I mentioned, we academics often write papers that are policy relevant. We publish those papers in academic journals. We don't pretend that policymakers are reading those academic journals. So we might go the quote unquote extra mile every once in a while to put an op-ed in a newspaper or on a news site, and then just sit there and hope that a policymaker picks up that op-ed and reaches out and talks about what can be done. That's the first problem we're trying to solve, is what extra steps have to be made to turn that research into actual policy. The second problem we're trying to solve is somewhat MIT specific, but in my experience is somewhat general as well across universities. And that is that there's a saying at MIT, let 1,000 flowers bloom. And what that looks like in the climate space is there are tens, if not 20 plus research centers on campus that work on some aspect of climate change. And sadly, when you let those 1,000 flowers bloom, they don't necessarily talk to each other. So one of the main missions of the Climate Policy Center is to be that connective tissue across all of those different centers. One of my colleagues in atmospheric science extended this analogy and said, yeah, sometimes those flowers have to be picked and put in a bouquet. And that's one of the other things that the Climate Policy Center is meant to do. The second is that, like I mentioned, policymakers aren't reading our academic papers. So there's this huge divide between the academic work and the policymakers. In the Climate Policy Center, that's why we're focused on hiring former staffers and postdocs who can be that go-between to build those bridges between the research that's being done here at MIT and policymakers. And in that research, often it's very complex. And I use this joke for a recent paper of mine that the main message behind this paper, if you're going to get it, you have to read all the way to page 31 and you have to look at figure 9 and you have to understand it. And that's where the kernel of importance is in this paper. So how do we take this research, that figure 9, and turn it into impactful policy? The goal is to reach all different levels of policymakers. And this comes out of the MIT Policy Lab, which is an ecosystem map of Washington, D.C. related to climate. And this, again, is why we need more than just academics to make this successful, is that we have to make inroads into all of these different organizations. And of course, this is already being done not by universities, but by and large by lobbyists. So in some ways, what we're trying to do is fill some of that vacuum or some of that space with objective MIT research, as opposed to allowing the lobbyists to be the only players in this game. So let me start or tell you a little bit about some of the work we've done. And my goal actually is to end a little bit early so that we could have a conversation, hopefully afterwards. So the first few projects that we did kind of highlight the problem that we're trying to solve. And this is a flow chart that I'll walk you through. So prior to the Climate Policy Center being launched, Senator Hickenlooper from Denver reached out to the MIT Policy Lab that I just mentioned. And Senator Hickenlooper had a bill called the Big Wires Act that would effectively require regions within the US to build enough transmission so that they could import 40% of their peak power to increase reliability and potentially reduce costs as well. And Senator Hickenlooper's staff reached out to the Policy Lab and said, hey, we noticed that the MIT Energy Initiative has done some work around the build out of more transmission in the electricity grid. Can they model our bill using the tools that they've developed so that we could really understand the impact of the bill? And Drew Story, who runs the Policy Lab, reached out to the researcher within the MIT Energy Initiative and asked if he would be interested in doing it. And he said, oh, I would love to, but unfortunately, I have no time. I'm actually he's a research scientist, so he's on what's called soft money. I'm working on my next grant. I would love to, but I can't do it. Typically, it would have stopped there. We would have told Hickenlooper's office, I'm sorry, we can't do that. They would have went to either some other academics or maybe a think tank or a consulting firm. Fortunately, though, at that time, I was trying to provide a demonstration project for what a climate policy center might look like. And I had hired a postdoc within another research center I run on campus called the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. When that postdoc came on board, I told him, hey, the MIT Energy Initiative has this model called Gen X. It allows you to model what the grid can look like under different policies, under different constraints, and so on. Learn that model. Drew Story at the Policy Lab had mentioned what had just happened, and I told Drew, I said, I have the perfect person to do what they were asking. So we put Juan on the project. Unlike a typical academic project that would take 6 months to a year, if not longer, to finish, we said to Juan, we need to do this in weeks, not months or years. He was able to model the bill within about a month and a half. After that, we flew down to DC. We debriefed Senator Hickenlooper's staff on the results. We put out an academic paper with the results, and Senator Hickenlooper then the next day used our results to get more people on board as co-sponsors for the bill. None of that would have happened absent having the infrastructure in place to do this work. Our results were then, or what we did for Senator Hickenlooper was then became known for Representative Kazar from Texas, who also had a bill that would build more transmission. In this case, connecting Texas to the other grids within the US. We modeled his bill. He used those results to get more support. And I'll mention that Representative Kazar's bill has no chance of ever being passed, and we could talk about why in a second. But now at least the representatives inside of Texas and the consumers inside of Texas and the households inside of Texas know what the impacts of that bill would be. And kind of the short story for why his bill is unlikely to be passed is that if it was passed, then Texas would be regulated by the federal governments. Their electricity grid would be regulated by the federal governments. But again, now they know what they're giving up from being unregulated. The Big Wires Act bill, to go back to the previous one, flavors of that actually do have a chance, even in this Congress, as part of a larger permitting reform initiative that's going on. Those are just two examples. I won't go through this long list, but we have plenty more as well. In less than 18 months, we've worked on projects across on the global scale with the UNFCCC, at the state level, and everywhere in between. We've also now are leading an effort on campus where we bring in 30 to 40 congressional staffers every year, and they spend 3 days here learning about the research that's being done here at MIT. So our vision, one of the key things that we want to serve as is a trusted nonpartisan, and that's key. I didn't highlight it in the previous slide, but we've worked on projects with both sides of the aisle. This is not just focusing on one side of the aisle. We want to be that trusted nonpartisan resource to bring in more objective research in the policy making process, and to ultimately serve as the front door for anything related to climate policy here at MIT. A lot of our projects so far have been where the policymakers come to us with their existing legislation and ask us to analyze it. But we've also done the other side of the street, where we take research that's been done here and turn it into bills. The work by Catherine Wolfram, my colleague here in applied economics at Sloan, related to methane emissions. We linked her up with a congresswoman from Illinois, and that congresswoman actually wrote a bill based on that research. Again, in this climate, we're having a tougher time getting those bills passed, but we're establishing the fact that MIT Sloan is a trusted source for objective policy level work. I mentioned earlier the climate project that's going on at all of MIT. Where do we fit into that? So the climate project created, apologize for the busyness of this slide, but the climate project created 6 pillars, if you will. We call them missions, but they're effectively disciplines if you stare at them. So from decarbonizing industry to earth and atmospheric science, to empowering frontline communities, to decarbonizing buildings, a very MIT level topic of wildcards. And then there's the 6th mission that is about inventing new policies. So less about translating the research into policy, but inventing new policies. The Climate Policy Center is going to span all of those and really be cross-cutting across those different missions, much like the MIT engine, on commercialization, or the Center for Entrepreneurship on commercialization, or the MIT Climate Sustainability Consortia that brings together industry. The Climate Policy Center is going to be working with all of these missions to, again, be the connective tissue across their different topic areas. How are we going to do all this? So what is our strategy? So really three pillars there. So one is getting the word out, heightening awareness of our expertise and our tools that we've developed as part of our academic work that are relevant to the policy process. Convening and bringing together the stakeholders is an important aspect here. And the example of what we call the congressional seminar is just one example of that, where we have these staffers here for 3 days to have frank and candid conversations, but not just with policymakers, the full gamut of stakeholders, including industry and the nonprofit sectors as well. And then, as I've highlighted a lot already, to be the source to analyze and translate policy proposals so that policies can be based more on data than before. Just a few examples of really that we're building on some early successes here at MIT Sloan and not in reinventing all of the wheels. A key aspect of the Climate Policy Center is to leverage the work that John Sturman did in developing what's called the En-ROADS model. And the En-ROADS model is you could think of it as a very complex atmospheric science model that can run in milliseconds as opposed to days and weeks. And John and the Sustainability Initiative here at MIT Sloan has been instrumental in using that model to educate policymakers, not just policymakers, but industry leaders, nonprofits, high school students, everybody, in terms of the impacts of climate change on several important outcomes. We're doing a lot of convening across policymakers and industry. Just an example of that, that actually this work turned into us getting a new paragraph, or an important paragraph in the most recent Massachusetts climate bill was based on this research and this work. This was around EV adoption and charging networks and the importance of real-time data. This came out of a conference that we ran with Harvard, the Salata Institute at Harvard, where we had all the interested stakeholders in the room, which then generated research, which then was translated into actual policy action. I've already kind of belabored this point, but the analysis and the translation is going to be key to having an impact in this space. There's the bill that I mentioned that Catherine Wolfram's research was the motivation behind. And Catherine has now moved on to having really deep conversations with the Brazilian government around the next COP that will be in Brazil. And her work around methane emissions and global climate clubs is actually one of the centerpieces of the COP that will be happening later on this year. As part of this process, we've now created a new outlet for research at MIT for that translation, what are called policy briefs, that we are now going around talking with MIT researchers and doing the translation for them so that we can make it as seamless as possible. How are we going to measure impact? Here, what we really want to see is actual policy coming out of these efforts. And we've already seen it at the state level, at the federal level. We are making inroads, even in this very difficult climate. Uh, and we are having deep conversations around um, policies that have impact on climate change, but are also uh, very relevant to the current administration's goals. And that could be around permitting reform. It could be around international trade issues, getting climate or greenhouse gas emissions as part of that conversation. Even with this administration, we've seen some openness to have those conversations and to actually have an impact over the next 4 years. But of course, we've pivoted somewhat to working more with states and more with the international community. Um, and that I think underscores the fact that we are going to have to be nimble and work with as many policymakers as we potentially can. So why don't I stop there, and hopefully we could have a bit of a conversation if possible.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Chris. That was wonderful. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm happy to help kind of moderate and share a couple for you to answer if that works best.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. So how can Sloan students specifically, it's kind of an easy one, get involved with the center, and what opportunities are there for them? I know you covered a little bit, but maybe a little more in depth.
Yeah, that's a great question and something we've been giving a lot of thought around. I think there's many potential ways. One is a lot of this translational work can be done by Sloan MBA students. The academic tools, the kind of things that you would require a PhD to move forward are already developed. So a lot of this is about how do we communicate that research to policymakers, and I think Sloan MBAs are perfect for that, and is really one of our strengths is that ability to communicate difficult issues and difficult topics to people without those PhDs or advanced degrees. I've also, and this is where, I'd love to, we won't do a poll, but, I have a dream where we have a class, an MBA class, where the goal of that class or the project that comes out of that class is an actual project with policymakers on a topic of mutual interest. So, that would be kind of a lab type class that we could potentially develop, which would be to take this even further.
Great, thank you. And one person had a question asking, is it only focused on domestic policy within the US, or is the Policy Center trying to, bridge gaps or partner with folks internationally?
Yeah, so I did mention Catherine's work with Brazil. I'll highlight another project, which is Christoph Reinhardt, who's on the faculty in architecture here, he calls it Globy, but it's basically his goal in life is to map every building in the world. And I used to laugh at him when he would say that, but he's getting there actually. So a physics-based map of all the buildings in the world, and he's working internationally with policymakers at the national scale, but outside of the U.S. and with UNFCCC to take that physics-based model of buildings and to make recommendations to national governments and the UNFCCC on how to decarbonize the building sector. We're also currently working with Heidi Neff, who's on the faculty in environmental engineering, who works on coastline resilience, and that will have a domestic feel to it, but obviously the coastal resiliency is an issue globally as well, and we're working to put her in contact with policymakers outside of the U.S.
And this is a little bit more of a niche question. As AI is, really spreading and becoming very popular. One person asked, how is the Climate Policy Center focusing on nuclear energy, and how does it fit into the equation?
On which energy? I missed.
Sorry, nuclear energy.
Oh, so you might have heard about the amazing scientific discoveries around fusion here at MIT, but there's also work around fission reactors that the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, in particular, John Parsons, has worked closely with Jacopo Buongiorno in nuclear science on advancing fission reactors. And they're not quite there yet where we could take that research and turn it into specific policies related to whether it's small modular reactors or permitting reform or regulatory reform in fission, but we hope to get there. So that does play an integral role here. I think that question mentioned AI. Another policy center project recently came out with what would happen, what would the grid impacts be if data centers were required to provide flexibility to the grid. So would that attract more renewables and make a more resilient um, resilient grid? And actually, I'm in the process of scheduling a conversation with a senator that senator staffers, their office that read that work because it was promoted by the Climate Policy Center. So that's a good example of kind of where data centers and AI might fit in this space as well.
Another question from an attendee is, how has climate policy under the current administration changed with the projects and initiatives of MIT?
Yeah, it's obviously changed. There's much less focus on climate. I will say, Secretary Wright, the Secretary of Energy, an MIT grad, does admit climate change is real, but I think where he comes down differently than many of us is the cost benefit analysis of addressing climate change. Um, we hope to have frank and candid conversations with the administration around that cost benefit analysis. But with that said, let's be real here. There's less appetite for within the administration. Now, I will say that within the legislature, at the Senate and the House level, there are Republicans that are worried about climate change and certainly want to pass legislation that is climate adjacent, where that legislation would actually lead to benefits from the climate change perspective. And that's where we're focused. We're still having active conversations with Republicans in DC around climate change. So, it's although it's not a focus of the administration, it's we're still making inroads into potentially greater future impact in new other administrations.
Great. And someone else is interested in kind of, finance and how that may be mixed in with climate policy if they're looking to cover climate finance topics. Is it something that they could get involved with in the center?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And actually, a research scientist here at Sloan, Florian Berg, is in the process of launching a new research initiative around climate finance in concert with the finance department here at Sloan. So that is just now getting off the ground and you know have them keep track of what's going on there and certainly reach out and I can put them in contact with Florian.
Great, thank you. Looking at, there's a couple of questions in here. Definitely, please submit more questions and let's take advantage of Chris's time. Let's see. One person's asking from an entrepreneurship perspective, if they have a startup, how do you all collaborate maybe with the entrepreneurship side?
Yeah, so obviously we have the Trust Center, but MIT also is affiliated with the Engine, which is all about commercialization. I will mention, and I should have mentioned this, the Climate Project, which is at the MIT level, um, just brought on board the first Vice President of Energy and Climate, Evelyn Wang, to run that or to lead that. And Evelyn comes from ARPA-E. So it's very much around entrepreneurship, commercialization, and so on. So that is going to be a big focus, and it should be at MIT. Now, I've always served as kind of a counterbalance and to kind of the innovation side of things, that we need policies to support that innovation and the markets and to create the markets for that innovation. But that's just a counterbalance. The overwhelming focus at MIT is still around new technologies, and startups obviously play a huge role in that.
Fantastic. Another question from an attendee is, what kind of opportunities are there for interdisciplinary approaches if someone's interested in climate policy and environmental justice and advocacy groups?
Yeah, so one of the missions is what, like, it's called Empowering Frontline Communities, and that is all about environmental justice and climate justice. And that's also been a big focus even prior to the climate project here at MIT. So um, when Ernie Moniz was Secretary of Energy under President Obama. He was on the faculty at nuclear science and then came back from his stint in DC. And when he did come back, he created what's called the Roosevelt Project. And that sits under the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. And the Roosevelt Project was all about trying to provide thought leadership on how do we decarbonize the US economy in a just and sustainable way. And all of our studies are publicly available, excuse me, on CEPR's website. And that had a fair number of phases, but the last two phases, the second phase was to actually go into 4 regions of the country and to work with policymakers to chart a pathway forward to decarbonize those areas without leaving behind the groups that traditionally get left behind in transitions. So we went into the industrial Midwest, Appalachia, the Gulf Coast, and New Mexico. And we've been working actively still with policymakers in those regions to think about the important environmental justice issues. The third phase was to do deep dives into 3 industries: critical mineral mining and processing, steel, and the grid. And to, again, work with policymakers to come up with ways to build out those industries in a just way. So that work has already been done here, and the Empowering Frontlines communities will in many ways take that and do more, as well as some other important work around climate justice and environmental justice. So it's a huge focus here at MIT, and there's ample opportunities for students to get involved, either through the Climate Policy Center, through CEPR, or the Climate Project.
Wonderful, thank you. A couple of questions about more of the industry side. I'm sure you mentioned this, so apologies if I'm asking again. If you could share some examples or some of the organizations on the nonprofits, NGOs you may collaborate with, and more of the, big oil, those types of industries.
Yeah, so the nonprofits, we have existing relationships with, the Resources for the Future of the world. We had conversations actually yesterday with ClearPath, who's more on the right center in this space. We've done work with Rhodium. My center's done work with Rhodium in generating what's called the Clean Investment Monitor. So those are the kind of nonprofits that I have in mind, as well as industry consortia as well. And MIT has had a long history of engaging with industry. So those bridges are pretty well built out. And that includes the fossil fuel industry, but also includes the clean tech industries as well as the Microsofts and the Googles of the world. So, I'm a firm believer that everybody's going to have a voice in this conversation for us to be effective. And we will definitely be leveraging those relationships.
Great, thank you. Um, just looking through a few of these questions. A good question here. Given the broad scope of the potential climate policy projects and research, how does the center decide which projects to prioritize and how much of the work is initiated from IT versus external stakeholders?
Yeah, great question. So we have I forget what we call ourselves, but we have a team of four, which is faculty and staff, that gauge potential projects and decide on where to place resources in those across those. And that depends on our ability to have an impact, whether or not we think good work is already being done outside of MIT on that topic area, as well as faculty interest. And I would expand that to student and researcher interest as well. Thankfully, the endowment means that we're not, we're still in the fundraising phase, but we're not pressed to go seek industry money or not that we won't, but that we have the flexibility to do a lot of work already without having to kind of join or do specific projects for industries. So that flexibility, I think, has been very instrumental in being nimble and being able to respond to uh, incoming requests from policymakers.
I know we've answered a lot, just kind of sifting through. Oh, very quick, easy question. I know you mentioned Catherine, the faculty member working on one of the research. What was her last name? Someone's asking.
Wolfram.
Wolfram, thank you. Another question, do you see trade and international relations impacting climate policy and the work that's being done?
Yeah, so that's a great dovetail to Catherine's work. So what Catherine is working most closely with the Brazilian government on or what called climate clubs. So if you know how the COPs work, they work very inefficiently. So, 180 plus countries go to one of these um, meetings every year, and what comes out of the COPs has to be unanimously approved by all the countries. So obviously that waters down a lot of the efforts that takes place. Catherine, along with researchers at Harvard, have been leading an effort to create what are called climate clubs. So a smaller group of countries that can agree on impactful initiatives without the kind of requirement to bring everybody along. And that's partly motivated by the what's called the now we're going to get into really nerdy details around policy, but a few years ago, Europe passed what's called the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And Europe has what's called a cap and trade system inside of Europe. So if you're a if you're making steel within Europe, you're paying for the carbon emissions that you generate from that process. But if I were to import steel into Europe prior to the CBAM, those imports wouldn't pay for the carbon emissions associated with that steel. So to level the playing field with domestic steel producers, now Europe charges a tax to those imported or exporting companies importing into Europe. That has created a huge motivation for those other countries to also price their carbon. Because if you export something to Europe and you price your carbon, then you don't pay the border adjustment. It's based on the difference between what the Europeans pay and what you pay domestically. So that has really catalyzed conversations around creating these clubs in response to a trade policy. And it's also creating conversations within the US of potentially border adjusting imports. So many of the products that US firms make are cleaner from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective than the imports that we're getting from China or India or our other major trade partners. So even Republicans, or I'll say policymakers on both sides, are now thinking about, well, can we have a border adjustment mechanism that penalizes for greenhouse gas emissions? So in many ways, trade is probably the way that we're going to get other countries to move in terms of climate policy. And that's going to be a major focus of not just Catherine's work, but the Climate Policy Center more generally.
And maybe this question kind of builds on that. I bet one individual is asking, how do you feel the balance between policy focused on adaptation versus mitigation is?
Yeah, another great question. So look, if you've ever taken an optimization class, you know, it, it it won't surprise you that probably the optimal path forward is to do both climate mitigation, greenhouse gas mitigation, and adaptation. Um, and I know that's uncomfortable for many people to appreciate because that you shouldn't think of it this way. It's not like we're giving up, but it's clear the climate has already changed and we need to adapt to that changed climate. This brings in the work that I mentioned with Heidi Neff in environmental engineering around coastline resiliency. Like, how do we build more resilient coastlines? That is a pure adaptation um, project. Catherine Wolfram and I are also about to put out a paper that asks the following question. If we look back over the last 20 to 30 years, how much are US households already paying for climate change? And how do we guard against that? So that also brings in adaptation. So the focus really is going to be on both mitigation and cost-effective adaptation. It's sad to say that, but that's the reality that we're living in.
Thank you. And another question kind of also building on that, with the work being done in renewable energy and the work to further in the industry, how are we looking to contribute further with IRA phasing out?
So this is so the tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act are phasing out. One of the things, some of the work that we did, and how successful we were, I guess is debatable. But going into the big beautiful bill, we were doing a lot of work highlighting just where those Inflation Reduction tax credits are going. And this comes out of, I briefly mentioned a few minutes ago, what's called the Clean Investment Monitor that we did in working with the Rhodium Group. And Brian Deese, who was the head of the National Economic Council under Biden and really instrumental in the Inflation Reduction Act being passed, he came to MIT after his stint with the Biden administration to catalyze this data, basically. And through the Clean Investment Monitor, we were able to show that 80% of the tax credits under the IRA were going to red districts. And we think that fact had an impact on just uh, tax credits were phased out, but clearly some were. So some of the work that we're doing in the Climate Policy Center is to highlight the impact of those phase outs, and then to work with states to see what options they might have available to fill in where the Inflation Reduction Act is going away. That's still work in progress, but there are many states that are interested in keeping the momentum that was generated from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Great, thank you. I know we're getting close to time, so we'll be mindful of that. Maybe we can end the questions with this last one from an individual asking, what does the state of climate policy look like to you on a macro level right now? And maybe one or two big goals for the center over the next coming years.
So at a macro level, I have to be honest, it hasn't been ideal the last year or so, certainly at the federal level. But I think I guess every problem creates an opportunity. I think one of the things, the opportunity that this is creating for the Climate Policy Center is to probably look beyond the US federal government more than we otherwise would have, which I think in a larger scale might lead to bigger impacts. US emissions is a small share of global emissions. So if we're really going to move the needle, we're going to need to be able to work with other governments across the world. And the last election is forcing us to do more of that. And we are seeing an audience. I mentioned Catherine's work. I mentioned Christoph Reinhardt's work. And that from a macro scale, I think is where more of our efforts will lie than they otherwise would have. So I'm optimistic that actually we'll make deeper inroads into those global organizations than we otherwise would have. And maybe at the end of the day, that will lead to a bigger impact from the Climate Policy Center.